Inheriting property in another country? Now, that sounds like something you'd only see in the movies, right? Like some treasure map, a long-lost relative you never knew existed.
Oh, you'd be surprised. I've seen those scenarios pop up more often than you'd think in international law.
Right. It sounds almost too dramatic to be real. But speaking of drama, that's what we're diving into today.
Little legal drama. I'm all ears.
Today's deep dive takes us straight to the Supreme Court of the Philippines to untangle this case, a seemingly simple request about a will from overseas and a property right here in the Philippines.
This is one of those cases that really highlights how messy things can get when different countries, different legal systems collide. We often think of inheriting assets as like just a transfer of ownership, but there's a whole lot more going on under the surface.
Absolutely. Let's set the scene for everyone. This case revolves around the estate of Lynetta, an American citizen living in Hawaii. Sadly, she passed away in 2017, leaving behind a husband and two daughters, one of whom is Allison, and a will.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah.
Pretty standard situation. And Lynetta's will was properly probated in Hawaii, which means a court there confirmed it's all above board according to their laws.
Everything seems in order. What's the catch?
Well, this is where things get a bit more interesting. Lynetta's estate included a piece of property
Okay.
in Pardo, Cebu City, Philippines. And it wasn't just any property. We're
Oh,
talking a prime parcel of land, officially valued at PHP 896 million total.
hold on. Did you say 896 million? That's not just some vacation home. That's a serious piece of real estate.
You got it. And that's where things get a little more complicated. While the will itself was straightforward, the Philippines, like many countries, has its own specific process for recognizing and enforcing wills from overseas.
Makes sense? Different countries, different rules. So how did this play out for Lynetta's daughter, Allison, who was tasked with settling her mother's estate?
Right. So Allison wants to do things properly, files a petition in the Philippines to sort out the inheritance, but here's where we hit our first legal speed bump. Both the municipal trial court in cities, the MTCC, and the regional trial court, the RTC,
Yeah.
they both dismissed her petition.
Wait, they dismissed her case twice? What happened?
Well, the MTCC took one look at the value of this land, all 896 million of it, and basically said, whoa, this is way too big for us to handle. This needs to go to a higher court. So they bumped it up to the RTC.
Okay, a higher court makes sense, but then the RTC dismissed it too. What was their reasoning?
Yeah, so even the RTC hesitated a bit. They stated that before they could proceed, certain legal steps needed to be taken care of, specifically related to recognizing that Hawaiian will.
So it wasn't that they were saying the will was invalid, just that Allison hadn't quite jumped through all the legal hoops yet.
Exactly. And let's be honest, dealing with this kind of back and forth, especially while you're grieving, that's tough.
I can only imagine. It would be easy to just want to give up at that point, but it sounds like Allison was determined to see this through.
Oh, absolutely. She was not giving up. In a pretty bold move, she decides to appeal directly to the Supreme Court of the Philippines, bypassing the Court of Appeals entirely, which is not common at all. This wasn't just about the property, it seems like. This was about principle.
Wow, a true David versus Goliath scenario. So what was at the heart of Allison's argument to the Supreme Court? What did she say the lower courts got wrong?
Allison argued that the lower courts had essentially misinterpreted Philippine law, specifically the rules of court that determine which court has the authority to hear certain types of cases. She firmly believed the RTC was the right place for her petition, that their interpretation of the jurisdictional rules was, well, flawed.
Okay. And what was the Supreme Court's take on all of this? Did they agree with Allison? Were the lower courts in the right?
And this is where it's really interesting. The Supreme Court, in a move that surprised many, took a deep dive into the very subtle but important differences between two key legal concepts: probate and reprobate.
Probate versus reprobate, I'll admit those sound incredibly similar to me.
Right. And that's where many people, even some legal folks, get tripped up. Probate is the process of saying, hey, this will is legit, which already happened in Hawaii, remember?
Right.
Reprobate is more about formally recognizing a will that's already been validated in a foreign country.
Ah, okay. So it's less about the content of the will itself and more about where it was originally deemed valid.
Precisely. And this distinction, this little bit of legal nuance, is where the Supreme Court really shook things up, because all of a sudden, Allison's case wasn't just about a property dispute. It became about a much bigger legal principle.
So the Supreme Court really honed in on this difference, this distinction between probate and reprobate. What did that actually mean for Allison's case, though? Did it help her?
It did. The Supreme Court, As they were reviewing everything, they determined that even though there had been updates to Philippine law, clarifying which courts handle certain cases, those updates, they didn't erase the RTC's authority in reprobate cases.
So even though parts of the law had been updated, the part about reprobate cases and the RTC, that was still valid. Okay, I think I'm starting to see where this is going. What was the final verdict?
The Supreme Court sided with Allison. It was a victory for her. They overturned those lower court decisions and sent the case back to the RTC to start the reprobate process for Lynetta's will.
Wow, what a journey, taking this all the way to the Supreme Court just to make sure her mom's will was recognized. It sounds like a pretty big deal. Did it set any kind of legal precedent?
Oh, definitely. It really shines a light on how different countries, different legal systems, how they approach these wills, especially as our world gets more and more interconnected. In many places, the focus is on, is the will itself valid, like what happened in Hawaii? Where the assets are, that comes later.
So you're saying that once a will has gone through probate in one country, other countries should just automatically accept it?
It's not quite that simple, unfortunately. Each country still has its own processes, its own safeguards in place, to prevent fraud and make sure things are done properly according to their specific legal systems.
Right, of course. But this case, it does seem to suggest that things could be a bit more, I don't know, streamlined.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Supreme Court decision so important, so noteworthy. It shows a growing awareness, even among courts, that this needs to be smoother, this whole process of international inheritance. The Philippines, recognizing that Hawaiian probate, that made things so much easier for Allison, and it's definitely a step in the right direction.
It makes you stop and think, imagine being Allison, you've lost your mother, and then you're dealing with this legal maze in a foreign country, no less. It would be so easy to give up, but she was determined.
And her tenacity paid off, not just for her, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. This case, it sets an important precedent, recognizing foreign probate like this. It really is a win-win.
It really highlights how important it is to understand these legal nuances, especially as the world becomes more globalized. For our listeners, especially those who maybe have assets in different countries, what would you say is the biggest takeaway here?
Plan ahead. I can't emphasize that enough. And seek expert legal advice. If you own assets in different countries, having a will that's valid in both your home country and where those assets are, it's crucial.
Great advice. Speaking of expert help, looks like we're almost out of time for this deep dive. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to this probate versus reprobate idea. Seems like understanding that distinction, that's crucial in these kinds of international inheritance cases.
Yeah, it's almost like that one key piece of information that unlocks a whole different process. Exactly. And for anyone listening, even just knowing these two processes exist, probate and reprobate, that could save so much time, money, heartache, all of it.
Right. Sometimes that little bit of legal knowledge, even if you're not a lawyer, it's so important these days.
It really is.
And speaking of knowledge, you mentioned earlier that Allison's case, it might signal a shift in how these international inheritance cases are handled going forward. What did you mean?
Well, this case, it really opens up this broader conversation about different legal systems. How can they work together more effectively, especially as more and more people are living and working and, owning things in different countries?
That's a good point. It makes you think, is it better for each country to have its own strict legal traditions, even if it creates roadblocks like it did for Allison? Or should there be a push for some kind of, I don't know, global legal standard for things like this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. It's a real balancing act. You've got to respect each country's laws, but then how do you make these cross-border situations, especially emotional ones like inheritance, how do you make those smoother? It's tough.
It really is. But at least in Allison's case, there was a positive outcome. Her persistence paid off, and that Supreme Court decision, that set a pretty big precedent.
Absolutely. By really digging into the nitty-gritty of probate and reprobate, and then choosing to say, hey, we recognize that Hawaiian probate, the Philippine Supreme Court, they made a big statement about our increasingly globalized world.
For sure. And I think it's a great reminder that even with something like wills and estates, which seems pretty standard, things can get complicated quickly when you add international borders into the mix.
Absolutely. The law is always evolving, always adapting. This case really highlights that.
It certainly does. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this fascinating Supreme Court decision. We covered a lot of ground today. From the very personal story of a daughter fighting for her mother's legacy to a nuanced legal battle with implications that reach far beyond this one case.
We really got into the weeds of international inheritance law
Explored that crucial difference between probate and reprobate.
and even touched on the future of legal systems in a globalized world.
And of course, we can't forget Allison, whose determination to navigate a foreign legal system may have just changed how these cases are handled in the future. She reminds us all that persistence, it really does pay off.
It does. So listeners, next time you find yourself wondering about any of this, remember Lynetta's estate and how this one woman's experience is shaping how we think about cross-border inheritance.
A good reminder that a little knowledge, some planning, and never being afraid to ask why can make all the difference. Until next time, keep diving.